On May 7, 1945, many believed that the surrender of Germany would finally bring peace to Europe. However, others believed that this newfound peace was nothing more than a momentary pause in the fighting. Some generals and even some heads of state believed that a new war between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was right on the horizon. One example of this was General George S. Patton, who famously told U.S. Secretary of War Robert Patterson regarding the Soviet Union's foothold in Eastern Europe that, quote, "We have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them, but we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war," close quote. In his journal, Patton later wrote that the longer that the Allies waited to attack the Soviet Union, the harder it would be to achieve victory. Even in Great Britain, thoughts of the possibility of war with the Soviet Union was running through the mind of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He instructed his high command to come up with a plan to attack the Soviets, which was codenamed Operation Unthinkable. The idea was that an attack on the Soviets may be needed to, quote, "impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire. Even though the will of these two countries may be defined as no more than a square deal for Poland, that does not necessarily limit the military commitment," closed quote. This square deal for Poland was important and personal for Churchill. The Polish had fought alongside the British during the war, and it was because of the German invasion of Poland that the UK declared war in the first place. Churchill even likely felt betrayed by Stalin. During the Yalta Conference in 1945, Stalin said that the Russians had greatly sinned against Poland, and that the Soviet government was trying to atone for those sins. He went on to say that Poland must be strong and that the Soviet Union was interested in the creation of a mighty, free, and independent Poland. This included free elections by secret ballot. Believing that Stalin would keep his word, Churchill said, quote, "Poor Neville Chamberlain believed that he could trust Hitler. He was wrong, but I don't think I am wrong about Stalin," close quote. Stalin did not permit free elections and instead installed a communist government in Poland. Churchill believed that force may be the only way to get Stalin to keep his end of the deal and to maintain the agreement at Yalta. When Operation Unthinkable was written and delivered to Churchill, it stated that in order to obtain victory over the Soviet Union, it would require either a decisive defeat of Soviet armed forces in Europe or the occupation of Soviet metropolitan areas. Neither option was deemed likely to occur. If the Allies attacked on July 1st, 1945, as planned, even with the full support of the United States, Poland, and the 100,000 rearmed German forces that the plan required, the Western Allies were outnumbered 2-1 in armor and also 4-1 in infantry. Unthinkable claimed that the Soviets importing nearly half of their aviation fuel from the Western Allies, the Soviet Air Force wouldn't be able to compete with the West. Unthinkable also outlined that the Navy of the Soviet Union to be no threat to the Allied navies, and it was said that the only thing that the Western Allies had to worry about was the army. The only place that the Allies could hope to advance was along the northern part of Germany, where the Navy could cover the left flank of the army and where the Allied forces could use their skills in amphibious warfare to their advantage. Even with all of this, though, the plan was deemed to be too hazardous to be put into action, and that total war with the Soviet Union would take place. Therefore, the offensive portion of Operation Unthinkable was summarily scrapped, and a new defensive plan, also under the name Operation Unthinkable, was created and reviewed. But what if things had played out differently? What if Operation Unthinkable was deemed to be viable? What if the Western powers and the Soviet Union had gone to war? That's what we're going to look at in this alternate history series, and this is how it would start. In early 1945, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin D. Roosevelt exchanged a series of letters outlining the need to limit Soviet influence in Europe following the end of the Second World War. Propaganda was spread across Germany of Soviet atrocities against the German civilians in Soviet-occupied territory. Some of these incidents were real, but most were over-exaggerated or purely fabricated. The idea was to have the German army focus more on preventing the Soviet advance and protecting their civilians than trying to stop the Western Allies. While ultimately unsuccessful in their aims of slowing the Soviet advance, the Western Allies were successful in creating a deeper hatred between the Soviet and German peoples. With the fall of Berlin and the surrender of Germany, many in the German armed forces were willing to fight on as resistance fighters despite the peace agreement. On the night of May 18, 1945, German POWs awaiting transfer to the United Kingdom or United States escaped and vowed to rally the country in a guerrilla war against the Soviet Union until the Soviets fell out of German territory. The Soviet Union was furious that such an escape of so many well-armed and well-rested German soldiers could take place. They claimed that the Western Allies were complicit in their escape. While the West denied these claims, the Soviets were correct. Under orders from Winston Churchill, British commandos had been training the prisoners prior to their escape to fight an asymmetric war against Soviet forces. More training was taking place in the US and the UK with German POWs who were willing to fight to push the Soviets out of the fatherland. Following successful raids in the South by these German resistance fighters, full German units, some in large scale, were signing up to push the Soviets out of Germany and to free their countrymen. They brought with them their weapons, men, vehicles, including tanks, and experience. Publicly, these Western allies pretended to stage raids to capture these Germans and denounce their actions, vowing to kill or capture anyone involved. In secret, though, the Western allies were covertly supporting the German resistance. They would attempt to rebuild the German war machine behind their lines. They would provide intelligence, food, weapons, and ammunition. If things worked well in Germany, the Allies would do the same in Poland and other areas that the Soviets had occupied. Even in the Soviet Union, the West hoped to take advantage of the low Soviet morale that fell even lower due to the German resistance and to sow discontent among the troops. The hope was that it would help stage a democratic revolution in the Soviet Union that would overthrow Stalin. However, in the case the plan failed, the Western Allies ordered German resistance fighters to make their attacks closer to the south and central portions of Germany in order to limit the number of Soviets in the north. If Operation Unthinkable, which now showed real promise, was put into place, there would be a weak spot in the Soviet lines that the Allies could attempt to push 47 divisions through if needed. Fighting was starting to flare up in Germany once again, and the West was starting to lose control. Whether they liked it or not, they were about to get pulled into the fighting that they had created but hoped to avoid. It was only a matter of time before Operation Unthinkable would be needed and more blood would be spilled in the Second World War.